The air in the Naval Communications Station on Amchitka Island tasted of three things: ozone, rust, and the damp, cold breath of the Bering Sea. It was an elemental cocktail that seeped through the concrete walls and into the very bones of the men who kept watch. Outside, a tempest of historic proportions was clawing at the Alaskan coastline, a swirling vortex of low pressure that had already been upgraded from a storm to a meteorological demon. The wind screamed a constant, high-pitched keen against the reinforced radomes, a sound that frayed the nerves more surely than any klaxon. Inside the station's primary relay control, the world was reduced to the sterile hum of server racks, the rhythmic blink of status lights, and the low murmur of men speaking the clipped, efficient language of their trade. This room was the digital heart of Task Force 77, a node of quantum-encrypted data that connected submarines lurking under Arctic ice to carriers patrolling the South China Sea. It was a place of immense, silent power, and it was Lieutenant Kalen Thorne's kingdom. Lieutenant Thorne liked the feel of the word kingdom. He stood with his feet planted wide on the anti-static flooring, his broad shoulders squared in a way that stretched the fabric of his navy blue coveralls. His face looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself. A strong jaw, a nose that had been broken at least once during academy boxing, and eyes the color of a winter sky over Norfolk. Authority, he believed, was not something you were given. It was something you projected. It radiated from you like heat from a furnace, and right now, his furnace was burning hot. He was holding court. A small cluster of young petty officers and seamen gathered around him, their faces upturned and eager. They were listening to him recount a story, a familiar one, about a bar fight in Subic Bay, embellished with each telling. His voice was a confident baritone that easily cut through the ambient hum, a sound that demanded attention. He was the lord of this small, vital fiefdom, and his subjects were appropriately loyal. In the far corner of the room, almost swallowed by the shadows between a humming server bank and a wall of diagnostic monitors, a figure sat perfectly still. If the men had bothered to look, which they had not, they would have seen a woman. She was not large, nor was she dressed in a way that commanded any sort of attention. She wore a simple, charcoal gray technician's jumpsuit, devoid of any rank, insignia, or name. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun, and her face, pale in the green and amber glow of the monitors, was unremarkable. She sat on a low stool, her back ramrod straight, her hands resting motionless in her lap. She was the antithesis of Lieutenant Thorne. Where he was a creature of noise and expansive gestures, she was a study in absolute stillness. Her eyes, a deep and startlingly intelligent shade of brown, were not looking at the men. They were fixed on a secondary status screen, a small, unassuming monitor that displayed the raw, uncollated data feed from the primary satellite uplink. She was watching the numbers scroll by, her expression unreadable, her presence as unobtrusive as a piece of stationary equipment. Her name was Ilara Vance, and in that room, she was a ghost. The narrative of Thorne's life was written in the currency of dominance. He had climbed the ranks not through singular brilliance, but through a dogged, unyielding application of presence. He understood, in a primal way, that in a hierarchy like the military, perception was reality. To be seen as being in charge was to be in charge. His confidence was a suit of armor he donned every morning, polished to a blinding sheen. But like all such armor, it was designed to protect something fragile underneath, a gnawing, persistent fear of being found wanting. He saw the world as a series of challenges to his authority, and he met them with overwhelming force. whether it was a questioning glance from a subordinate or a technical problem that exceeded his limited understanding. His solution was always the same: project more confidence, speak with more certainty, and never, ever admit ignorance. He was a product of a system that sometimes rewarded the loudest voice over the most competent mind, and he had learned the lesson well. Ilara Vance, on the other hand, was a product of a different system entirely. Her world was one of pure data, of elegant and brutal logic. She did not deal in perception, she dealt in absolutes. The quantum state of an electron was not a matter of opinion. The structural integrity of a data packet was not subject to debate. In her universe, things either worked or they did not. Authority was not projected. It was demonstrated through results. For the past 4 hours, she had sat on that stool, observing the flow of information through the network she herself had designed. She was on Amchitka for a system-wide diagnostic, a final check of the upgrades that had been rolled out 6 months prior. It was a task she could have delegated, but she believed in touching the metal, in feeling the pulse of her own creation. She was a master architect visiting the cathedral she had built, walking its halls in silence, listening to its stones breathe. Her quietness was not a sign of meekness. It was the profound calm of absolute, unassailable competence. It was a stray reflection in a monitor that finally broke Thorne's self-imposed bubble. He saw her, a small gray shape in the periphery of his kingdom, a foreign object, an anomaly. He paused mid-sentence, the story of his glorious right hook dying on his lips. His audience, sensing the shift in his attention, turned to follow his gaze. The collective weight of their stares fell upon the woman in the corner. She did not flinch. She did not turn. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen, her posture unchanged. To Thorne, this was not just an anomaly. It was an act of defiance. Her stillness was an insult. Her silence was a challenge. "Well, well," Thorne said, his voice dropping into a register of theatrical condescension. "What do we have here?" He pushed himself off the console he had been leaning against and began to walk toward her, his boots making deliberate, heavy sounds on the floor. The small group of sailors followed him like pilot fish trailing a shark. He was putting on a show, and they were the audience. He stopped directly behind her, looming over the small stool. He was a mountain of blue fabric and indignation. She still did not move. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her, something like soap and ozone, and it irritated him. It was too neutral, too clean for this place of grit and sweat. "You lost, ma'am?" he asked. The word "ma'am" was delivered with a thick coating of sarcasm. It was a verbal pat on the head, a dismissal. "This is a restricted area. The civilian contractor's lounge is down the hall. I'm sure they have a nice pot of coffee and some magazines for you." For the first time, Ilara Vance moved. She did not turn her head. Instead, her eyes slowly shifted from the monitor to the reflection of Thorne's face in the dark glass. She saw the smug curl of his lip, the challenging glint in his eye. She saw the insecure man playing the part of a commander. Then, in a voice that was low, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion, she spoke. "I am not lost, Lieutenant." The simple, factual statement hung in the air. It was not defiant. It was not angry. It was merely a correction, delivered with the same dispassionate tone one might use to state the current atmospheric pressure. This lack of a proper, emotional response was gasoline on the fire of Thorne's ego. He had expected fear, or at least flustered deference. He had received data. His face tightened. The show was not going according to script. "Is that so?" he sneered, leaning down, invading her personal space. He planted a hand on the console next to her head, his knuckles white. "Then you're trespassing. This is primary relay control for the entire battle group. I am the officer in charge of this watch, and I don't recall seeing you on any access roster. So I'll ask you again. Who are you, and who do you answer to? Some desk admiral in Norfolk? A subcontractor from Lockheed?" The sailors behind him shuffled their feet, a few of them snickering. This was the part of the show they enjoyed. The takedown. They had seen the lieutenant do this before to junior officers, to contractors who got too big for their boots. It was a brutal but effective display of the pecking order. Vance's eyes remained on his reflection. There was a flicker in them now, but it was not fear. It was something else, something cold and analytical, like a biologist studying a particularly noisy insect. She was a lioness, allowing a jackal to dance and yap at the very edge of her kill radius, curious to see just how bold it would become before the inevitable conclusion. "My presence here," she said, her voice still unnervingly calm, "is on a need-to-know basis. You do not need to know." That was it. The ultimate sin. Not just a lack of deference, but a direct challenge to his authority, wrapped in the infuriatingly placid tones of bureaucratic certainty. The blood rushed to Thorne's face. His performance of command was tipping over into genuine rage. He felt the eyes of his men on his back, and he knew he had to escalate. He had to break her. "Need to know?" He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Lady, I am the need to know in this room. That console you're staring at, that's my gear. This whole room is my responsibility. Everything that happens in here is on me. So you are going to tell me who you are right now, or I'm going to have the master-at-arms escort you to a holding cell to figure it out." He straightened up, crossing his arms over his chest. It was his power pose. This isn't a debate. This is an order. Vance finally turned her head. She rotated on the stool with a slow, deliberate grace and looked up at him. For the first time, he saw her face directly, not as a pale reflection. He saw the utter, placid calm in her eyes. It was like looking into the deep ocean. There was no anger, no fear, nothing he could use as a handhold. It was profoundly unsettling. She seemed to be considering his words, not as a threat, but as a flawed logical proposition. "An order from you, Lieutenant," she stated, "is not binding on my authority." She paused, a flicker of something almost like pity in her eyes. "You are operating from a position of profound ignorance. I suggest you rectify that." "Rectify this," Thorne growled, his last shred of composure snapping. His hand shot out, and he snatched a specialized diagnostic probe that was lying on the console next to her. It was a delicate, expensive piece of equipment. He held it up, dangling it in front of her face. "This is my gear, my house, my rules. You have no authority here. None." She looked at the probe, then back at his face. She did not recoil. She did not raise her voice. She simply issued her own quiet, devastating command. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice dropping a half octave, becoming as hard and cold as carbon steel. "You are interfering with a Level 1 strategic asset. Put the tool down, return to your station, and get your commanding officer on the line. Now." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it stunned him into a moment of silence. A civilian, a small, gray woman, was giving him a direct order in his own control room. The absurdity was so immense, it was almost comical. He felt a bubble of hysterical laughter rising in his chest. He let it out. A loud, braying laugh that echoed in the high-tech space. His men, taking their cue, joined in with nervous chuckles. My commanding officer? Thorne choked out, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. You want me to call Captain Davies? Oh, that's rich. You think he's going to take your side? He leaned in again, his voice a conspiratorial, mocking whisper. Tell you what, you seem to think you're important. So let's play your game. You want to talk to someone in charge? Fine. He gestured to the main comms panel, a grand sweep of his arm. Go ahead. Call your boss. Call your regional manager. Hell, call your general. He spat the word general as if it were a joke, the army equivalent being the most ridiculous concept he could conjure in his naval world. Let's see who they send to bail you out. He turned to his men with a triumphant grin. The humiliation was complete. He had cornered her, exposed her as a nobody with delusions of grandeur. He had won. Ilara Vance looked at the comms panel. She looked at the smirking face of Lieutenant Thorne, and then she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A reasonable suggestion, Lieutenant, she said, her voice a flat, dead calm. And at that exact moment, all the lights in the room went blood red. A piercing, monolithic alarm blared, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated deep in the chest. It was the cascade failure alarm, an alert so rare that most of the junior sailors had only ever heard it in simulations. Simultaneously, the deafening scream of the wind outside was punctuated by a sound like the sky cracking in half, a colossal thunderclap that was felt more than heard. The entire building shuddered as if struck by a giant's fist. On the main status board, a dozen critical systems went from green to red in an instant. The primary satellite link icon, the very reason for the station's existence, blinked once, then vanished. They were blind, and they were deaf. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through the control room. The laughter died in the sailors' throats, replaced by choked gasps. Their training kicked in, a frantic, disorganized flurry of activity. Men were shouting, running to their stations, their voices tight with fear. The carefully constructed edifice of order had shattered into a million pieces. And at the center of it all stood Lieutenant Thorne, frozen. His face, moments before flush with triumphant arrogance, was now a mask of pale, slack-jawed shock. The diagnostic probe fell from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. All the confidence, all the bluster, had been stripped away by that single, terrifying alarm. He stared at the board of blinking red lights, his mind a frantic, useless blank. He was the commander. He was supposed to give orders, but he had none to give. The crisis was so far beyond his experience, so far outside the neat boxes of his training manuals, that he was paralyzed. He was a statue of incompetence in the heart of the chaos he was supposed to control. He shouted something, a reflexive bark of a command. "Report! Somebody give me a damage report!" But his voice was thin, swallowed by the wail of the alarm. His men were looking at him, their eyes wide with fear and a dawning, terrible question. What do we do? He had no answer. He could only stare at the abyss that had just opened up in front of him. Then, through the cacophony, a new sound emerged. It was the sound of movement. Ilara Vance rose from her stool. Her previous stillness had been a coiled spring, and now it was released. She did not run. She did not panic. She moved with a fluid, terrifying economy of motion, a predator in her natural element. The chaos did not touch her. The alarm did not faze her. For her, the world had not ended. It had simply presented a new set of data points to be processed. She glided to the main systems console, the one Thorne had claimed as his own. Her hands, which had been resting so placidly in her lap, became a blur. They flew across the keyboard, her fingers dancing a complex, incomprehensible rhythm. A cascade of command line prompts filled the screen, a language no one else in the room could read. "Lieutenant Thorne?" she said, and her voice cut through the alarm like a surgeon's scalpel. It was not loud, but it possessed an absolute chilling authority that seized the attention of every man in the room. They turned from their frantic, useless tasks and stared at her. Thorne, startled, looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Your primary and secondary uplinks are offline," she stated, her eyes never leaving the screen. The lightning strike caused a sympathetic power surge that fused the primary bus bar in the external relay. The backup generator is trying to compensate, but it's redlining. In 90 seconds, it will either shut down or it will explode. You have lost all strategic communication capabilities. She delivered this catastrophic diagnosis with the same flat affect she had used to order him to call his CO. It was not a panicked warning. It was a statement of fact. A young petty officer, his face white as a sheet, stammered, "Ma'am, what do we do?" Vance's head snapped up. She looked at the young man, and for the first time, her eyes held something other than cold analysis. It was a flash of pure, focused command. "You," she said, her voice sharp, "will manually decouple the power conduits to the secondary server farm. Use the emergency breaker. Do not wait for a software handshake. It will not come. Go." The sailor, galvanized by the certainty in her voice, scrambled to obey without a second thought. She pointed to another sailor. "You, get on the hard line to the power plant. Tell them to kill the main grid feed to this building. Tell them the authorization code is Chimera Alpha 9er. They will understand. Move." The man bolted from the room. She was not asking. She was not suggesting. She was issuing commands with the innate authority of a creator speaking to her creation. The room, which had been a maelstrom of panic, began to find a new center of gravity. It was her. The men, who had looked to Thorne for guidance and found none, now turned to this small, gray woman as their only hope. Her competence was a physical force, a palpable presence that bent the chaos to her will. She turned back to the console. Her fingers flew again. "I'm bypassing the fried bus bar and rerouting primary power through the tertiary diagnostic conduits," she announced to the room at large, though it was clear she was speaking more to herself. "It's a dirty fix. The conduits were never meant to handle this much power. They'll start to degrade in about 20 minutes. I need to establish a new handshake with PAC-SAT 7 before they melt." Thorne watched, dumbfounded. He didn't understand half the words she was saying. Chimera Alpha 9er? Tertiary diagnostic conduits? It was a foreign language, a secret dialect of expertise he could not comprehend. He was a spectator in his own control room. The authority he had so carefully cultivated had evaporated, revealed as nothing more than a cheap costume. He was watching real authority in action, and it was nothing like his blustering performance. It was quiet. It was efficient. It was absolute. He saw his men responding to her with a speed and certainty they had never shown him. They weren't obeying her out of fear of punishment. They were obeying her because her commands made sense on a primal, instinctive level. She was the only one who knew what she was doing. With a final series of keystrokes, Vance brought a new display onto the main screen. It was a raw telemetry feed, a waterfall of numbers and symbols. "I have a connection," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "It's a pinhole, but it's there. I'm piggybacking on a weather satellite's diagnostic channel." She donned a headset from the console, her movements swift and precise. I need to authenticate and get priority access before the system boots me. She spoke into the headset, her voice now a clipped, formal monotone. This is Station Amchitka to any listening command authority. I am declaring a Level 1 communications failure. Repeat, total strategic comms blackout. I am on a non-secure tertiary channel. I require immediate priority access to Pacific Fleet Command. Authentication code is Sea Dragon. I repeat, authentication is Sea Dragon. A wave of static answered her. The pinhole connection was fragile. The storm was still raging. Thorn watched, his heart pounding. The name Sea Dragon meant nothing to him. It sounded like a call sign from a bad action movie. He felt a desperate, pathetic hope that she was bluffing, that this was all some insane, elaborate hoax. Then, a voice crackled through the static. It was faint, distorted, but it was there. Repeat last transmission. Channel is unstable. Vance's posture became even more rigid. This is Sea Dragon, she said, her voice sharp and clear, imbued with a sudden immense weight. I am on site at Amchitka. We have had a catastrophic failure of the primary comms array. I have established this temporary link. I need to speak directly to CINC PAX FLT now. There was a pause. The static hissed and popped. Thorn held his breath. Then the voice came back. And this time, it was utterly different. The distortion was still there, but the tone had changed from professional curiosity to sharp, immediate deference. Sea Dragon, authenticated. Stand by. Patching you through. The room went silent, save for the hum of the servers and the distant howl of the wind. The sailors stood frozen at their posts, their eyes locked on Vance. Thorn felt a cold dread creeping up his spine. The effortless way that name, that call sign, had sliced through layers of protocol was terrifying. It was a key that opened locks he didn't even know existed. A new voice came over the headset, and this one was perfectly clear, imbued with the deep, calm authority of high command. It was a voice Thorn recognized from fleet-wide addresses. It was the voice of Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorn, no relation, the 4-star admiral in command of the entire United States Pacific Fleet. Sea Dragon, this is Olympus, the voice said, using the admiral's personal call sign. Report. The name Olympus landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. The sailors' eyes went wide. They were listening to God. But it was the admiral's next words that shattered Kalen Thorn's world completely. Ilara, is that you? What the hell is going on out there? The use of her first name, the casual, familiar way the most powerful man in the Pacific Ocean spoke to this unassuming woman, was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. Thorn felt the floor drop out from under him. The cold dread in his stomach became a black hole of horrified comprehension. Vance, however, was unfazed. Admiral, she said, her tone professional, but with an undercurrent of familiarity. We sustained a direct lightning strike to the external array. It caused a cascading power surge that has crippled the station. I've bypassed the primary relays and established this link, but it's temporary. The hardware I'm using will begin to physically melt in approximately 15 minutes. She paused. I can rebuild the primary link, but I need you to authorize a full system purge and a remote reboot of the Chimera encryption core. It will take the entire Pacific network offline for approximately 30 seconds. There was another pause. Taking the entire network offline, even for 30 seconds, was an unthinkable act. It was the equivalent of stopping the fleet's heart. Only a handful of people in the world had the authority to even suggest such a thing. Do it, the Admiral said without a moment's hesitation. The trust in his voice was absolute. The network is yours, Dr. Vance. Get it back online. Dr. Vance. The title hit Thorne like a punch to the gut. Doctor, not a contractor, not a tech. Doctor. Just then, the main door to the control room burst open. Captain Davies, the station's commanding officer, rushed in, his face pale. He was followed by the base Master Chief Petty Officer, a man named Garrett, a legend in his own right, a walking repository of naval tradition with 3 decades of service etched into his face. "What in God's name is happening?" Davies demanded, his eyes scanning the chaos. "I just got a call from the power plant about an authorization code I've never heard of." His eyes fell on Vance, who was still at the console, her back to him. "Who is this civilian?" Before Thorne could even begin to form a response, before he could try to explain the colossal, career-ending mistake he had made, the Master Chief's eyes widened. Garrett, the man who had seen everything, who feared nothing, froze. His gaze was fixed on the small woman in the gray jumpsuit. He saw the way she held herself. He saw the way her hands moved on the keyboard. He saw the absolute focus in her posture, and he recognized it. Admiral Thorne's voice, still audible from the headset she had placed on the console, crackled again. "Captain Davies, I trust you are giving Dr. Vance every asset she requires?" Davies stared, confused. "Dr. Vance? Sir, I'm not aware." It was then that Master Chief Garrett took 2 sharp steps forward. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, his hand-stitched gold chevrons seeming to glow in the dim light. In a voice that was a thunderous roar, a sound forged in the engine rooms of destroyers and on the flight decks of carriers. A voice that could stop a bar fight or a mutiny with a single syllable, he bellowed, "Attention on deck!" The command was a physical shockwave. Every sailor in the room, including Captain Davies and the shell-shocked Lieutenant Thorne, snapped to the rigid, unwavering posture of perfect attention. It was a reflex drilled into them from the first day of boot camp, an instantaneous show of respect for a high-ranking officer or an admiral. But they were not looking at the captain. They were not looking at the door. They were all, by the Master Chief's unyielding command, facing the back of Dr. Alara Vance. The Master Chief, a man who would offer a lazy salute to most admirals, was standing at perfect, ramrod-straight attention for the unassuming woman in the civilian jumpsuit. The message was unmistakable. It was a gesture of profound, almost reverent respect. Slowly, as if in a dream, Vance finished her final command sequence. A line of green text flashed on the screen. "System purge complete. Rebooting Chimera Core." She took off the headset, placed it carefully on the console, and turned around on her stool. She surveyed the room full of men standing stiffly at attention, all of them staring at her with a mixture of awe, terror, and dawning comprehension. Her gaze swept past the sailors, past the captain, and finally settled on Lieutenant Kalen Thorne. Her expression was not triumphant. It was not angry. It was clinical. It was the look of a teacher about to correct a student who had made a fundamental, dangerous error. The narrator's voice would later fill in the gaps for those who did not know, telling the story as it passed into legend. It would explain that Dr. Alara Vance was not just a doctor. She was the doctor. The architect of the entire global strategic communications network, the inventor of the Chimera quantum encryption algorithm that protected it, a civilian with a security clearance that made senators look like interns, a woman who held the rank equivalent of a 4-star admiral in any matter concerning the system she had built. Her call sign, Sea Dragon, was a myth, a ghost in the machine. The name whispered by comms techs when they talked about the system's legendary, unseen creator. And Lieutenant Thorne, standing at attention, felt the full, crushing weight of that legend settle upon him. He had not just insulted a civilian. He had not just been arrogant to a contractor. He had, in his blind, swaggering ignorance, tried to humiliate a god in her own temple. He had laughed at her. He had challenged her. He had told Sea Dragon to call her general. The silence in the room stretched for an eternity. The only sound was the gentle, restored hum of the servers and the distant, fading cry of the storm. The crisis was over. The reckoning was about to begin. Vance let the silence hang for a long moment, allowing the full weight of the situation to settle. She looked at Thorne, whose face was a canvas of dawning horror. The blood had drained from it, leaving a sickly, waxy pallor. His eyes, once so full of arrogant fire, were now wide with the terror of a man who has just realized he has walked off a cliff and has been treading air for the last 10 minutes. He was still locked at attention, a statue of disgrace. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, yet it filled the entire room. "At ease," she said. The command was followed by a collective rustle of fabric as the men relaxed from their rigid postures. Though none of them truly relaxed, Captain Davies let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he entered the room. Master Chief Garrett remained standing tall, his eyes fixed on Vance with an unwavering expression of respect. Vance's gaze, however, did not leave Thorne. She stood up from the stool. She was not a tall woman. Thorne was a good head taller than her and broader by half. But in that moment, she towered over him. Her presence was immense, her quiet authority more powerful than any physical size. She walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate on the anti-static floor. She stopped a few feet in front of him. "Lieutenant Thorne," she began, her tone analytical, as if she were diagnosing a piece of faulty equipment. "Let us analyze the events of the last hour from a tactical perspective." Thorne flinched at the word tactical. This was not the personal dressing down he had expected. This was something far worse. It was a clinical dissection of his failure. "1. Your primary duty as the officer of this watch," she continued, "is to ensure the operational integrity of this station. This involves two key components: the management of your equipment and the management of your personnel. You have failed catastrophically on both counts." She took a step closer. "Let's begin with personnel assessment. Upon observing an unknown individual in your restricted area, you made an assumption. You did not assess. You did not verify. You assumed. You assumed, based on my gender and my civilian attire, that I was a non-essential, low-level employee. Your prejudice formed the basis of your entire tactical response." She held up a finger. "First failure point: confirmation bias. You saw what you expected to see, not what was actually there. A critical vulnerability in any intelligence gathering situation." She held up a second finger. "Second failure point: escalation based on ego, not on threat. My response to you was non-aggressive. I provided no indication of hostile intent. I merely refused to comply with a demand for information that you had no authority to request. Your reaction was to escalate. You perceived a challenge to your personal authority, and your ego required you to win the confrontation. You were not managing a potential security breach. You were putting on a performance for your subordinates." Her voice was relentless, each word a precisely aimed dart. "Which leads to the third and most critical failure point: You prioritized the assertion of your own status over the security of a Level 1 strategic asset. You were so focused on humiliating me, on proving that you were in charge, that you became a direct impediment to my work. The work I was sent here to do. The work that ensures this very station and the fleet it serves can function. She paused, letting the indictment hang in the air. Thorne's eyes were glassy. He looked like a man who was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. When the crisis occurred, Vance went on, her voice dropping even lower, becoming even more intense. Your command authority, which was based entirely on performance and posturing, evaporated. You froze. You had no effective orders to give because your leadership was a hollow shell. Your men, trained to look to you, were left adrift in a situation that demanded immediate, expert action. Your ignorance and your arrogance combined to create a vacuum of command at the most critical possible moment. Had I not been here? She left the sentence unfinished, the implication hanging in the air, more damning than any direct accusation. Captain Davies stepped forward, his face grim. Dr. Vance, I am profoundly sorry. Lieutenant Thorne's actions are inexcusable. I will see to it that he faces a full captain's mast and UCMJ proceedings. His career in the Navy is over. Thorne visibly flinched, but said nothing. He simply stared at the floor, his world in ruins. Vance turned her head slowly to look at the captain. No, Captain, she said, her voice firm. Davies blinked, confused. No, Doctor, his behavior was a symptom of a deeper problem, Vance interrupted, turning back to face Thorne. Punishment is an inefficient solution. It removes the problem, but it does not teach a lesson. Lieutenant Thorne does not need to be drummed out of the service. He needs to be educated. She looked directly into Thorne's eyes. He finally met her gaze, and what he saw there was not malice, but a terrifying, impersonal resolve. Captain Davies, Vance said, now addressing the CO but still looking at Thorne. I am formally requesting that Lieutenant Kalen Thorne be reassigned, effective immediately. He will serve as my temporary administrative aide and liaison for the remainder of my time in the Pacific Theater. A wave of shock rippled through the room. Thorne's jaw literally dropped. He was being assigned to her, too. He will carry my equipment, Vance stated, her voice flat and absolute. He will arrange my transport. He will take notes in my briefings. He will stand behind me at every system diagnostic, at every command conference, and at every hardware upgrade from here to Pearl Harbor. He will not speak unless spoken to. He will observe. He will listen. And he will learn. He will learn what real authority looks like. He will learn that competence is quiet. He will learn that the most important person in a room is not always the one with the loudest voice or the shiniest rank. He will learn to see beyond the uniform, beyond the gender, beyond his own petty ego. He is not being punished, Captain. He is being enrolled in a mandatory one-on-one postgraduate course in humility, and I will be his sole instructor. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a fate so much more devastating and profound than a court-martial. It was not a simple end to his career. It was a complete and total deconstruction and rebuilding of his entire worldview, administered by the very person he had tried to destroy. It was a brilliant, elegant, and terrifyingly personal form of justice. Thorne finally broke. His shoulders slumped. The last vestige of his pride shattered. In a choked, barely audible voice, he whispered, "Aye, ma'am." Vance gave a single, sharp nod. "Your education begins now, Lieutenant. My diagnostic kit is by the door. Fetch it." and as Kalen Thorne, the once proud lord of his small kingdom, turned and walked stiffly to retrieve the bag of the woman he had mocked, the story began its journey into legend. The tale of Thorne and the dragon became a fixture in the naval communications community. It was told in the server rooms of aircraft carriers and the cramped comms shacks of destroyers. It was whispered to new ensigns at the officers' club and recounted by grizzled master chiefs to teach a vital lesson. With each telling, the storm grew more violent, Thorne's arrogance more pronounced, and Dr. Vance's quiet competence more mythical. The story became a modern military fable, a cautionary tale about the mortal sin of underestimation. Years passed. The world turned. The technology Vance had designed was eventually superseded by even more advanced systems, but the lesson endured. On a crisp autumn afternoon at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, a group of newly commissioned ensigns sat in a lecture hall. They were bright, ambitious, and full of the unearned confidence that is the hallmark of youth and privilege. At the front of the room stood their instructor for modern naval leadership, a commander with a quiet, watchful intensity. He was not a large man, and his voice was not loud, but when he spoke, the room listened. His name was Kalen Thorne. He looked out at the sea of young, eager faces, and he saw himself 20 years earlier. He saw the same arrogance, the same certainty, the same blindness. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm and measured. "For the next 16 weeks, we are going to discuss what it means to lead in the modern Navy. We will talk about strategy, about ethics, about tradition. But today, I want to start with the most important lesson you will ever learn. A lesson that is not in any of your textbooks. A lesson I learned the hard way." He leaned against the lectern, and his eyes took on a distant look, as if he were seeing a ghost in a cold, concrete room on a distant island. "I'm going to tell you a story," he said, "about the single greatest humiliation of my life. I'm going to tell you about the day I met a small, quiet woman in a gray jumpsuit. I'm going to tell you about the day I told her to call her general. I'm going to tell you about the day I met Sea Dragon." And as he began to speak, recounting his own epic failure with a raw and painful honesty, the young ensigns leaned forward. They listened as he described his own arrogance, his own blindness, his own fall from grace. He used his own life as the primary teaching tool, his own shame as the ink with which he wrote the lesson. He told them how he had spent 2 years as Dr. Vance's shadow, watching in silent awe as she solved impossible problems with quiet grace, commanded admirals with respectful authority, and treated every person, from a seaman recruit to a fleet commander, with the same level of dispassionate professional courtesy. He taught them what she had taught him: that true strength is not loud, that authority is earned through competence, not demanded by rank. He taught them to look for the quiet person in the corner. He taught them to listen more than they spoke. He taught them that the most dangerous enemy they would ever face was their own ego. The story concluded, as it always did, with the moral that had been forged in the crucible of his own disgrace. The final lesson that Dr. Alara Vance had beaten into him, not with anger or punishment, but with the relentless, undeniable force of her own excellence. It is the core truth of any great endeavor, in the military or in life, a principle as immutable as gravity. Do not judge a person by the uniform they wear, or the one they do not. Do not mistake quietness for weakness, or confidence for competence. In the final analysis, your titles, your posturing, your performance of power, all of it is meaningless noise. Let your actions be your only argument. Let your work be your only rank. For in the moments of true crisis, when the alarms are screaming and the lights go out, the world does not turn to the person who is in charge. It turns to the person who knows what to do.